I'm Joyce Hornady. You might say accuracy is my business. I make bullets.
You are listening to the Hornady Podcast.
Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Hornady Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Swerzik, and today I've got a table full of engineering types. I've got project engineer and favorite on the show, Miles Neville. Got project engineer Ryan Damman and the assistant director of the engineering division, Joe Thielen. Guys, thanks for coming on our podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Seth.
Glad to be here.
Yep. So we're going to get that in Miles We Trust on a T-shirt. That's in the works among some others.
Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah. But we do trust in Miles. We trust in Ryan. Obviously, we trust in Joe. And the reason I got you guys on the show for the technical aspect, one, obviously, our listener loves to hear the technical stuff. They love to hear from Miles. They love to hear from Joe. They love to hear from Ryan on why, how, what are the engineering hurdles? How does it get manufactured? And not just the design and the concept of the bullet, but the physical nature of setting a bullet up on a press and making millions upon millions upon millions of them that all perform to our standards. It's a tough job, and people love to hear how we accomplish that. Now, more specific to how we accomplish that, we've got a couple bullet lines that have just, we've got a lot of great product lines, especially in bullets, but we've got a couple that have really risen to the top. If you've watched any Macho Man Randy Savage back in the day, he's the cream rising to the top, brother. And we've got a couple that for the large majority of hunters in our country and across the world have really gravitated towards the ELD-X bullet and our new CX bullet. Between those two, man, you have got a ton of capability anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world for a huge variety of game and shot distances. But one of the questions that we get pretty regularly is, which one? How do you pick one? Why should I pick one? How do you do it? So I wanted to get you guys on to discuss kind of not a battle, not a versus per se, but a versus. You guys remember epic rap battles of history. We're going to pair these things up against each other. We're going to have the CX bullet versus the ELD-X bullet. We'll go into some science of how they're designed, how they're engineered, and what their strong suits are, and then maybe look at what they're good but not great at. We'll do that for the other bullet and then summarize it by a direct comparison and set up some examples, some anecdotes, some stuff we've experienced of maybe when you should pick one over the other. So, before we dive in, a couple things. Number one, the listener, if you're interested in these two bullets and you haven't, you need to check out number 7, podcast episode number 7, where we detail all things CX. It's a great podcast. Joe, I know you were on there. I forget who else we had on the show because that was a long time ago, but it was a great podcast. And then, not as long ago, number 87, we had Dave Emery on the podcast, and we talked about the ELD-X and the ELD match development. And so those two podcasts will get the listener a very, very in-depth idea of those individual bullets. We're not going to hit all those details. We're going to hit some wave tops. And number 2, and probably more importantly, is that there are deer falling right now to some archery hunters. There are seasons open. And man, this podcast, if you just listen to the same time frame last year, I guarantee I was all geeked up because it's almost hunting season. It was 59 degrees out this morning.
Yes, it was.
Here's some pheasants cackling. The deer are out in the bean fields. I mean, it's just electric. And I just can't help but get excited. And so you're going to see a natural tendency on the podcast over the next few months that are probably going to be a little more hunting oriented because we can't stop. Joe, I know
we like to hunt. Why we got to talk about it?
It's what I was over bugging the heck out of Ryan. I probably took 15 minutes of his engineering time to talk about his hunting plans for the fall.
Well, did you see Judge Arzinka come over yesterday or day before? He's got his gun, man.
Oh,
antelope hunt, and it's the Judd. And Judd, he cracks me up because he's all excited. He's like a little kid in a candy store. But I mean, if you lose that,
what are you doing?
Yeah, what are you doing? Exactly. So anyway, it was fun to watch. I know he was talking to you about it that day.
Yep, got a new cannon, so he had put that on his.
Oh yeah, Thunder Beast Ultra 5.
This thing hasn't killed an antelope yet, but I've had it out. I can't wait. He said, he's all excited.
That hunt is coming up. So I say that just to prime the listener, one, for this episode, because it is very hunting focused, the ELD-X and the CX, and then also the next couple months of episodes, I'm just going to have a hard time talking about anything else. So before we divulge too much, I'd like to approach the podcast by kind of detailing one bullet and design, engineering, etc., and then its strong suits and maybe, like I said, not its weaknesses, but what it does good but not great. And then we'll do the same thing for another bullet, and then we'll summarize it, pair it up together. And I'd like to start with the CX bullet. And I want to start with CX because ultimately it's a older, air quote, older bullet, because its predecessor was the GMX, which we came out with in 2009, which that was our first entry into monolithic bullets. And I knew that took a considerable amount of design and research into how do you manufacture it. How did that play out? Because it wasn't easy, and we manufacture them very similar to how we manufacture a cup and core bullet, which is probably not the norm.
Yeah, we use the same machinery, but obviously the tooling is completely different because you're dealing with a solid slug of copper and getting it to move and form and get the geometry you want inside the ogive of the projectile to get the expansion, accuracy, terminal performance, everything that you want was a challenge. I mean, I know all of us sitting here have touched it one shape, way, or form at some point. So
how do you really control the expansion when you're dealing with this copper zinc alloy as a solid pellet? You shape it into a bullet. Are you controlling that largely just by the cavity inside the bullet? Because you can't do anything to the material.
Right. Each cavity in every projectile is specific to that projectile, specific to the velocity window it's going to operate in, the ogive length and the shape. So then that comes into the cartridge that it's going to be loaded in. But yeah, each one is unique. So you have a final shape you want to get to inside that projectile before it gets swedged up. So that when it is swedged up, you got room for the tip and it swedges up the way you want it to. So you got to backtrack. How do you get there from the beginning? And so pretty much each one is unique. So the whole process, the front half of the tooling setup
is unique to every bullet.
That design is unique.
Wow. And so you're creating that cavity so that the polymer tip can drive rearward and have a thin enough material that it can still push it open, but thick enough that it holds together.
It's still got to be super thin on the top to swedge up on that tip and not close up to nothing, but it tapers thick quickly. So that comes into design. Just like you said, you're starting with a copper slug. Mm-hmm. It's not like a cup, and we'll talk about that too. It's not like a thin-walled cup, and you got a lead core. It's tapering down to 100 thou a side.
Whoa!
Quickly. Mm-hmm. So you got to be able to control that, and those punches get pretty intricate.
Yes, they do.
And that's whole other story about how we manufacture the tooling to make those bullets has come a long way too.
Yep, and I know the mechanical engineers and the tool and die makers that are listeners are going to find, if we could divulge a lot of that, they'd find that very interesting. But that is a neat aspect that we were able to use the same machines and then make some tool and die or punch and die modifications to really draw these things out, similar to how we do a cup and core bullet. And it's fascinating that each bullet is truly unique to that bullet as far as that hollow cavity in there. That's pretty cool. So we figured that out. We figured out how we're going to do it in 2009. And the GMX bullets were fantastic. They were a great bullet. They did a lot of things well. And I will say, we made those bullets, the initial 2009 to 2000, whatever it was, 22 or 3, we made those bullets a traditional shape. And when I say traditional, I mean, if you look at like our SST bullets or our interlock bullets, the ogives were efficient, but not super long. And the boat tails were pretty modest at best. So ballistically, they were okay, but they didn't have that super long ogive, long boat tail appearance of a match bullet. They were pretty standard, if you will, because at the time of their design, 300 Win Mag, 308 Winchester, 30-06, the 6.5 Creedmoor was barely coming online. It was not super popular yet. 270 Winchester, a lot of those iconic hunting cartridges were still very, very heavily used, as they are today. But our PRC family, our Creedmoor family, our ARC family hadn't really rounded out yet. So you fast forward a little bit, and those families that I just mentioned, they rounded out. And what we found was we were in a position where we had these cool cartridges. We had a really solid monolithic bullet offering, but none of us were using them. very, very few people internally that are, hunting the West and doing, adventure hunts or shooting, precision rifle matches and are really good riflemen. None of us were using those bullets. And I remember talking to Jaden Quinlan. This is when I worked with him briefly and was working with you. It's like, well, why don't we use them? Well, because they limit me. I want to be what limits me, but that bullet limits me in that they're just not very ballistically efficient. They don't hold on to velocity very well, and they have terminal performance, but it's inside of my shooting window. I could maybe stretch the legs if I needed to if they were more efficient. So we go to the drawing board, and Jaden, really at the helm, isolated a way that we could still put on those cannular grooves, because that's a big one. You put a cannular groove on a monolithic bullet, it serves a couple purposes: to reduce the bearing surface, helps reduce the pressure a little bit, gives some of that added material a place to go, gives you a place to crimp. So you need those, but they negatively impact the drag. So Jaden and our engineering team, you guys, found a way to still include the cannulars, but not impact the drag quite so much. Yep. Tell us about that, Joe.
So the CX design is, obviously we'll talk about heat shield, but the cannular grooves were big. So when you square off the grooves,
with a square cutter.
Yeah, when the corners are very, very crisp and square, a shockwave will attach there. Well, shockwave attaches there, then you increase the drag of the projectile, you lower the BC. So by simply making those curved, if you will, rounding them off, you reduce the drag by, what, Miles, 5 to 10 to 20%, depending on which projectile and the shape and velocity and all those things.
5 to 20, depending on what
it was.
Yeah. Some of them didn't change a terrible ton, but then some of them it was like, whoa,
pretty considerable.
That was worth doing.
But when we did the math, it was 50 to 100 yards easily of retained velocity.
Right.
Because
added performance distance
100%.
just by changing the cannular shape.
Yep.
Yeah, because the monolithic bullets, which I'm sure we can get into, but we should preface that right away. Those things are solid copper, right? They need velocity to work. You talked about, man, we weren't using them as much as we were using other projectiles back in the day, and that's because they required,
2,000
they performed
feet per second.
better in certain hunting scenarios or situations just because they're monolithic. They're not as soft. They require higher velocity. We built all of those bullets for existing cartridges, SAMI head height, SAMI lengths, everything. I mean, they were designed to the least common denominator.
Yep.
GMXs fit in everything.
Yep.
And then obviously when we did CX, we uncorked that a little bit and built the bullets we needed to build for some of our cartridges that we did.
And I remember pretty vividly Jaden saying, so why are these cannulars square? And the answer was because the cutter we order is square. And so the cutter was like, well, that's an interesting answer. So went through an iterative approach of making bullets with no cannular, and then making them with one cannular square, one cannular radius, and then two cannulars radius, two cannulars square, and just measuring the drag. And we were able to say, okay, here's how we can keep that bearing surface reduction of adding a cannular, but not impact the drag quite so much. And then, Joe, you mentioned the heat shield tip addition.
Yep. So we put a heat shield we put it on all the bullets, right? But it really, really shines on some of those more efficient projectiles. 6.5 130. I'm sure you're going to hit that one.
Oh, yeah. We've got some pipe hitters in
7 30. Anyway, yes, you put that heat shield tip on there. The bullet hangs on to velocity longer.
And it's more consistent.
No deformation in flight, and it still gives you all the terminal performance that you need. So that was like a no-brainer. Like, yeah, duh, easy, put it in there. And then if you're going to put it in a couple of them, put it in all of them.
So the CX line, when it launched as the CX, had the heat shield tip, had the new cannular dimensions, and because it had a heat shield tip that would resist the effects of aerodynamic heating, we were now able to shoot these over Doppler radar, get Doppler radar verified ballistic coefficients, and measure the drag and put them in our Fordoff calculator where you don't use ballistic coefficient. You have the true drag of the projectile in there. So that was a lot of benefit for the modern hunter, the modern shooter. And then, Joe, you alluded to it, but man, when we rounded out the PRC, the Creedmoor, and the ARC family, we were able to truly design the ultimate monolithic bullet for some of those specialized cartridges.
Absolutely, which existed only in hand loader stuff, if they existed at all prior to that. Well, now we can load them in ammo.
Yep. So the first one that I remember, seeing was a 240 grain 338. And that was back when we were still making square cannulars. We ended up not making that bullet, but that was basically the 285 grain ELD match ogive on a monolithic bullet. That looked big. But the first one I remember working on that ended up being a product was the 190 grain CX. And that thing, huge. I can't remember which bullet that's modeled after. Is it the 212 ELD-X shape?
Yes.
So you get...
Yeah.
It's
right.
212, 212 ELD-X.
So you get that long ogive, long boat tail, that the shape drag, and the shape has a pretty heavy hand in the overall drag of the bullet. So you maximize the shape to increase your ballistic performance, but you still get the hard-hitting terminal performance of that monolithic material. So that 190 was an out-of-the-box home run that we could load in factory ammo in 300 PRC.
Yeah, it's a monster. That's like a 600-yard capable, like at least
Yeah,
all the
monolithic.
time in 300 PRC. Like you don't have to worry about it.
Right. And that one came out like, wow, well, why don't we do one of these in 6.5 for that 6.5 PRC? So you end up with the 130 grain modeled after our 143 ELD-X. Next was the 6mm, which is a 90 grainer, modeled after that 103 ELD-X. And then my personal favorite for last, Ryan, this is probably hopefully in your favorites as well, but that 7mm,
160.
that 160 modeled after our 180 ELD match bullet, not modeled after the ELD-X, modeled after the match bullet. Super long ogive. You want to talk about a good looking bullet combination? 7 PRC with that 160 on top. Mercy sakes. When I hunt with that combination, I actually pre-notch my tag because it's inevitable. It's just, you can't stop it. But it really was neat to see that lineup of bullets round out to fulfill our new stable of cartridges. And now you've got, that 90 grainer for a hand loader would be a great fit in that 6 arc and really maximize that potential for, antelope and deer size game. And then you've got the factory options for the PRCs. And what I really like about that is one of the things that the CX does good but not great is those middle distances. At traditional range, Joe, like you mentioned, that CX, it's the number one bullet. You're shooting stuff 300 yards and in, that CX is going to absolutely thump things. It is incredible. It thrives on speed. So in a Magnum cartridge, or if you're shooting super performance ammo where it's factory loaded, you get that added velocity. It's great. Where it does good but not great is in those middle distances, where you're flirting with kind of non-traditional. In that 400-yard area, 400 to 500 yards, it just didn't do well. Well, now with these new shapes for our new cartridges, now it's starting to get better. It's not the best for those longer range engagements, but it's better because those bolts are more efficient.
Yeah, retain that velocity further down.
Yep. And we do that
We
with
should
shape.
clarify that, though. When we say when they work, we just say they work really well. We want a hunting bullet to open up and to
expand,
mushroom and expand. That's what
to caliber and a half.
That's what. So all of our listeners make. Well, what do you mean it works? What does work mean? Work to us is the bullet has enough velocity, enough energy to open up.
Yep.
And that's how you get the temporary and permanent wound cavities in there, and be able to dispatch the game.
Yep. And our bare minimum is caliber and a half. And that's a good looking uniform expansion caliber. So if you're shooting a 308, it'd be 308 plus half of 308. So that's a good looking expanded bullet. And that's 2,000 feet per second, generally across the board from 6mm all the way up to our 338. That 2,000 feet per second bottom line is about the same.
Other than like the monoflexes and
We've got
the
some
stuff for lever gun
corollaries.
design. Yep.
handgun hunter, obviously.
Designed for other stuff.
Yep.
Yep. So the CX thrives in traditional range engagements, some of the newer stuff in, those middle distance type engagements, and it thrives through shoulder, through thick hide, through,
it
just
doesn't care. It holds together. Your weight retention is going to be there. You can't, you can smoke through bone and the bullet holds together. And
what's the weight retention on CX for the listener?
minus the tip most of the time.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. At least 95%, but usually to the tune of
Usually more.
98.
Yeah.
And that's confidence inspiring, especially when you get a bigger animal like an elk and you get the quartering to or the quartering away, and you can confidently know, I'm going to put this thing directly where it needs to go, and it's going to go in a straight line. And more often than not, it's going to come out the other side too.
Yeah. So that's typical, upper 20s to 40 inches of penetration with those.
Yeah, depending on your impact velocities and what you shoot it out of.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So,
Ryan,
yeah, loving
Ryan
the
and I have had
CX.
this. Yeah, Ryan and I have had this conversation many a times. If you want to go and you're shooting somewhere where it's going to be closer, the velocities are up, and you need blood trails and tracking stuff, CX is going to give you 2 holes.
Yep.
They're going to give past those. I had a guy, a good friend of mine in South Africa. I don't know if he hasn't shot many GMX or CX in the past, but he got some and started shooting them, and he's been WhatsApping me pictures and just because they obviously autopsy most everything, and he's like, I'm very impressed at this performance. I cannot believe I can get this type of performance from a projectile fired in a 308. And I talked to him, well, that's what they were designed to do is entrance, exit hole, make the animal, bleed out essentially so you can track it. And those guys are so good at tracking over there. If it bleeds, they're going to find it.
Mm-hmm.
So he was just thoroughly, and then the angled shots, the client or you make a less than perfect shot because we're all human, right?
We've all done it.
That CX bullet will make up for me making a less than perfect shot, that's a vote of confidence right there.
Yep. So one of the things that I think the CX thrives in is if you're going across the pond.
100%. Absolutely.
If you're going after Africa Plains game, I would urge you to strongly consider taking the CX.
100%. Absolutely.
Yep.
Especially in that flat, brush country where 300-yard shot is a long shot there.
Yep.
Most of them are 100 yards-ish.
Yeah, 200 yards, 100 yards.
Yep, but it might be quartering away. I mean, the PH didn't be like, hey, I need you to take that shot. That's the animal. There's our shot right there. Take it. Okay.
Yeah, you don't have to go, well, I got to wait. I want him to turn broadside.
Yep.
PH says take him. You warm him up.
Exactly.
All right. So that's what it thrives in, and we discussed it, but where it doesn't thrive is on the extended range. When velocity's decayed, you start flirting with 2,000 feet per second or less, we got to draw the line right there. And that really plays into education. As the hunter, as the shooter, you need to educate yourself with a ballistics program, know what you're shooting, know what your muzzle velocity is, and know what your impact velocity is, because those velocities are what make this bullet really work.
I think another good point too is like for hand loaders, you can't weight for weight. Most of the time, you cannot get the same velocity as you can with a cup and core bullet with the monolithic.
Sure, good point.
To get that weight, it's lower density, so you have to have more bullet volume to take in that Rob's case capacity, and then they're also harder, so the engraving forces are higher. So to get to the same pressure takes you're not going to get the same velocity out of it.
Yep, and that's a great point. Obviously, it's not rocket surgery. Lead is incredibly dense. This copper alloy, not as dense as lead. So you end up with bullets that are really long, but just not as heavy. And it's a key that as a hunter, as a shooter, you don't get hung up on bullet weight when you're talking monolithics. Because if I was shooting a 300 Win Mag, I'm shooting 165 grain CX.
Because it's like a 180 grain cup and core, or a little more. Yeah.
I'm going to pick up muzzle velocity. I know the bullet's going to hold together. I'm going to flatten their trajectory, and it's going to just hit like a freight train. So don't necessarily get hung up on the weight. And there's a lot of dogma from decades ago that, if you're shooting a 7mm, you need to shoot a 175 grain bullet for elk. Not with a monolithic. You can get away with a lot less because it's not energy that really does anything. The energy is a corollary. It does, but it's not the energy. It's the velocity, which is obviously it's squared in the energy equation.
Yeah, and bullet weight for bullet weight, a lot of times energies end up being pretty close to each other anyway, and then it's the delivery more or less that you're getting there. And so, just different ways that the bullets work.
Right. All right, so I feel like we flushed out the CX pretty well. We know what it thrives in. We know what it's good but not great at. We know how it's put together. Let's shift gears now and hear a word from our sponsors.
Bore Driver ELD-X. Fast and easy to load. The polymer base seals the bore and engages the rifling, while the post and pedals grip the bullet's boat tail. With its superior ballistic coefficients and reduced drag, the Bore Driver ELD-X drives its 340 grain bullet to target with the energy and accuracy that turns shots into success. When you have one shot this muzzleloader season, make it count and use the best. Bore Driver ELD-X from Hornady.
All right, so now let's talk about the ELD-X. Now, the ELD-X bullet, for me, I'm assuming for a lot of you guys, that was just like, your first love. It is just, I'll always have a special place in my heart for that ELD-X bullet. And I use that ELD-X often, and I use it with confidence. But a very, very difficult task when you guys were assigned to make the bullet. Now, for the full history, I mentioned go back to episode number 87. But we do need to talk about the initial assignment, if you will. Jason Hornady on a hunt. There's other folks in camp hunting with other stuff that's not Hornady. It's a hunting camp. And he witnessed some non-traditional shot distances shot with hollow point boat tail design bullets that lacked consistent terminal performance. And he came back not disgusted, but he came back with, hey, people are out there doing this. I can't stop them from doing it, but I can give them a better product to do it. So the assignment was, Joe, Dave, Jaden, Ryan, I need a match accurate bullet with a polymer tip that gives me reliable terminal performance at traditional range and consistent, dependable terminal performance at extended ranges. Essentially, make me a dream bullet. Make me the perfect bullet. Scamper out. Go on, kids. Get it done. Get your chores done. That's a huge assignment, especially when it's never been done like this before. Walk us through that process of digesting, okay, this is what he wants. How are we going to do that? And then what led to what became the ELD-X.
Well, the easy part, I'll jump in here, and then Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you, because the easy part is designing the shape, the external shape of the projectile. It's got to fit in this
I
cartridge.
could do that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You draw it up, you put it in ProDAS, it's stable in the twist rate.
Yeah. You want a long ogive? I'll just stretch her out. Yeah.
So we draw, that was the easy part. Yeah, here, this bullet, this shape, this will do everything. And then we had to make them.
So, Ryan, up until just about a year ago, your day-to-day as an engineer was designing punches and dies to get the desired shape internally and externally of the bullet on the press so they'd come out looking like what we had planned, designed, and making them perform and shoot accurately. Miles, that's your job currently. So that in and of itself is difficult. Walk us through kind of briefly what you're trying to control with those punches and dies in the design, and then how that was compounded by what the ELD-X was and what was required of that jacket.
Yeah, so most often you're designing a projectile, you know, okay, it's going to hit something. If it's a hunting bullet, it's going to hit an animal at this velocity because it's loaded into these cartridges. So I know muzzle velocity, range. I know based on the chamber design, I can get a shape that looks like this. It's going to give you a certain amount of drag, certain BC. And so you can assume within a range what velocity you're going to get at on target. So then backtrack, what do my thicknesses need to be and where do those thicknesses need to be located top to bottom in the jacket?
Mm-hmm.
How does that lead need to be swedged up around a tip if we're using a tip? But this was, for the ELD-X, it was, well, if we need low velocity expansion, that's going to be the toughest. We got to start there. How do we get these standard caliber cartridge rifle bullets to expand at previously velocities you wouldn't even try to get them to expand at?
The goal, or what it turned out to, I don't know if it was the goal, 1,600 feet per second. That's what they reliably expand a caliber and a half at.
The initial goal was, in our heads at the time, in my head, it was 1,000-yard shot. You got to be able to have a bullet that'll expand in all these different cartridges because it was a number to throw out there. You know,
we certainly don't recommend that.
We don't recommend it, but it's like, well, that's the goal at the end of the day. So, you know, those are low velocities. And at the time, it was 1,450, 1,500 feet a second that we were getting bullets to expand at. And then that rolls into the whole heat shield tip and where we started with the tip and early days of radar and all that. So, yeah, back to draw punches and jacket thickness. That we ended up going through a lot of intervals on that, a lot of iterations on lead shape, how that lead's formed around the tip. At the end of the day, you're just the actual tooling design kind of take for granted, but that's fairly straightforward. But yeah, it was just trial and error. Realistically, and then at the end of the day, everything in design is a compromise. So, and you'll hear guys now too, the compromise is high velocity with those ELD-Xs if you're shooting something right up close. So you got to get something to expand super low velocity, but it also needs to hold together at muzzle impact, basically.
Yep.
So that's where the trick was in designing that jacket profile from top to bottom.
Yeah.
To get that best compromise. And that's what we got with the ELD-X.
I know that had to be tough because if you haven't, as the listener, if you haven't seen a sectioned photo of an ELD-X versus, say, something like an SST or a sectioned bullet of, say, a match bullet, the jacket is not the same thickness in every spot. On a match bullet, it's generally the same thickness from top to bottom. On an SST, it's tapered, but not that bad. On an ELD-X, the bottom of that jacket and around the boat tail and the shank is dramatically thicker than, say, the ogive portion of that bullet. So getting a jacket to be that thick at the bottom and then draw it out thin as it approaches the top had to be incredibly difficult to keep that concentric, to not work that jacket too much to keep your accuracy. That had to be a challenge.
Yeah, that was also early on. We doing how many draws can we? The number of draws was an option on the table because generally we have a certain number of draws. Can we do that more or less? The cold work you put into the copper, is it getting too hard? Is it not getting hard enough for that low velocity expansion? It's different. You can compare it to like our other traditional lines, SSTs and spire points, interlocks. Their draw punches are essentially the same geometry, same general shape. And we kind of threw that out the window with the ELD-X and had to add angles and radius and stuff that you can't see. If you section a bullet and look at it with the naked eye, you're not going to pick up those thickness differences because they're pretty small. And we're talking thousands. And then small radius, small angle tapers and everything. And all that was played with pretty much it's in the front half of the bullet, right? You got your thick certain portion above the boat tail, get to your interlock. Then above that, that's what controls your expansion. You want your bullet to pull back and stop at that interlock. And then that's where all the experimenting came with.
Yeah. And so you did all that experimenting. You ended up with a bullet. Fast forward, go back to episode 87 if you want to hear the full story. But you do all this, and you end up with bullets that perform well down to 1,600 feet per second of impact speed, hold match-grade accuracy, and will also hold together reasonably well at that 20, 30, 40, 50 yards, 100-yard shot. And you do all of that. It takes a lot of time, but you nailed it. And then now, like you'd mentioned, you almost take it for granted now. And Miles, you came in as an engineer post ELD-X development. And so has that, I know you don't take anything for granted per se, but that technology and how that draw process looks like taking over in bullet design, is it something that was relatively easy to step into?
There's definitely more tricks with the ELD-X that you got to pay attention. More points that you have to pay attention to than like an ELD match or a boat tail hollow point or something like that. Those are pretty straightforward. But yeah, with ELD-X and with the critical duty projects that I've had to work with, I've been very grateful to stand on shoulders.
Yeah. Well, those two bullets you mentioned are probably two of the single most technical bullets that you can make as far as features go out of a cup and quart bullet from, I would say, any manufacturer. They are incredibly, incredibly feature rich and difficult to do all of that. But you guys did a great job.
The HIT Target Impact Indicator. Instant hit confirmation at extended ranges has never been easier. The HIT Target Impact Indicator easily attaches to most target stands and not the steel target itself. The highly sensitive internal accelerometer detects vibration when the target is impacted, activating the red LED lights that flash Morse code for HIT. Where impact confirmation can be difficult, light it up with the HIT Target Impact Indicator from Hornady.
So the ELD-X thrives, one, if you're looking for match-grade accuracy. Not that the CX bullets are inaccurate, because that's certainly not true, but the ELD-Xs are held to the match accuracy standard, and they perform really well at those non-traditional distances. Where they're maybe good but not great is the traditional distance shot, say just 250 yards and in, especially out of a Magnum. One of the things that we discuss heavily in episode number 87 is what we refer to as the continual expansion of an ELD-X. And some people who are unfamiliar with this as a topic and how it works might feel that there are certain failures of bullets that they've shot, ELD-X bullets. And I'd like to discuss that continual expansion idea so that it makes sense to people, because I've explained it a lot, but I feel like we should explain it again. There's a fixed amount of lead in a bullet, and if the lead's flowing out of the top of the bullet, That means it's also drawing up from the bottom of the bullet, and there's a finite amount of lead in there, and if that lead slips past the interlock ring, they'll separate. But what I love about the ELD-X is that continual expansion where it flows out of the top and it'll kind of shear off, and then it'll continue to flow and kind of shear off. It gives you a straight penetration track. And I can imagine during your design, Ryan, that terminal performance aspect was tough to control because you control that with how you draw the jacket and the jacket thickness and where the lead's at. That had to be tough.
Yeah, that continual expansion, Jaden and I and Dave kind of discussed that early on because we were noticing these extended temporary and permanent cavities compared to traditional rifle bullets. You get these in gel, these long, giant wound cavities, and it's because that front end of that bullet has to be by design a little bit weaker, a little more able to open up at those low velocities with less energy. So you get that initial impact with Nexen gel almost immediately inside an inch a lot of
an inch, and you're getting expansion, and that's important.
And then that continues, so that front end of the jacket, as it gets tougher and as it thickens up, it starts to slow down. But yeah, you're usually peeling that back all the way to interlock. And so you'll hear that same testimonial over and over about guys finding bullets in the backside hide.
Yep.
And the core might be hanging out just barely, or a little bit of lead at the interlock. But it's losing its core through the penetration, but I'll argue it's not a separation. It's not a core separation.
Yeah.
Because you'll see when cores separate in jackets, they blow up right away, and they're not going to penetrate 26 inches through an animal.
They're going to go 10, 12, maybe.
If that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, you pull it out, and it's behind the backside hide, and you set it on the table, and the lead might fall off. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. But I think it did its job if it just went through 2 feet of organs and...
Yep.
Yeah, that's what the listener needs to understand. A copper jacket, what does a copper jacket weigh at an ELD-X? 30, 40, 50 grains? There's no mass in the jacket. All the mass is in the core. And a 30 to 50 grain jacket will not penetrate 18 to 20 inches of animal if the lead is not with it the whole way. It has to be. It's just physics.
Yep. Yeah. It's hard to...
So it's not a
you can
not
see
a
it.
separation.
Like if you have a I don't know, poorly made or poorly designed bullet that the copper rips down all the way on one side and the lead comes out like within the first 6 inches, 8 inches or so, that's done. Like that's
a failure.
That turns into a VMAX penetration that maybe goes a foot in, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And so these where they're holding together and then separating at the end, it's like
the bullet did its job at that point.
The core and jacket are together the whole way. They stay together, and they're locked into through the whole thing. It's just you peeled through the whole bullet basically. Yep. And a lot of guys too, like, will take bullets maybe designed for 308 velocity and then throw it into a 300 Win Mag and shoot something up close, and it's like, yeah, I mean, you're going to get that.
Yeah, that's the whole 30 cal 200 178 ELD-X thing. The 178 is for a 308, guys. Designed
for 308.
200 grain was designed for the Win Mag.
Now we had a huge demand for 178s in the Win Mag, and we do that skew. Yeah,
because some guys that get it want to shoot it. I get it, but I want people to know those bullets were designed, as Ryan said early on. They were designed with a purpose. Absolutely.
Yeah. And the ELD-X design that I've done gets tricky that way because you have available cartridges that those bullets can be loaded in that have muzzle velocities from 2,600 foot per second all the way up to 3,400 foot per second or more. And it's like, where do you draw the line of what's reasonable with that? And so somebody eventually is probably going to load those at 3,600 foot per second, and it's going to peel all the way back, and they're going to tell me that, this bullet failed.
Well,
sorry, but
yeah. So you design things for as many applications as you can, but we still live in what I call the real world. And the shooter, we're putting out a ton of information. We have a technical staff. You can just call and ask us. We're putting out information on the podcast, through all of our media outlets to educate yourself. So it's hard to claim ignorance. Like we're trying to get information out there for the hunter, for the shooter, for the reloader, so that they can make the right educated decision. And this was a good example of this continual expansion we're talking about. Was I had a friend of ours, a friend of the company, an outdoor creator, media creator from Denmark, Thomas Nissen. And Thomas came over here, never shot a whitetail deer, and he wants to shoot it with a classic looking M77 Ruger Woodstock 6.5 Creedmoor. He wanted any cartridge, but that he wanted to go classic American looks. So we got a nice Ruger M77, 6.5 Creedmoor with a Leupold 3-9 scope on there. Just a classic Midwestern combination. Shooting 143 ELD-X, and he gets an opportunity at his first whitetail buck, quartering away shot, puts it right through where he needs to. Deer runs 30 yards and tips over. Everybody's high-fiving. It was a great experience. And so we rolled the deer over, and I'm looking on the other side, and I'm running my hand on the bullet, and oh yeah, there it is, right there. So it's quartering away, so it probably went 18, 20 inches. Came in mid-rib, came out on the shoulder, but it didn't come out. It was trapped. So pulled out my pocket knife, and I cut that thing out, and I pulled it up, and I set it in his hand, and the lead core was flat as a pancake, still attached to the jacket, but it fell out. And he's like, oh, that separated. That can't be right. And we had to have the discussion of that bullet went 20 inches at an angle through the deer and went in a perfectly straight line directly through the thoracic cavity. And it had an eighth of an inch of hide to pop out, and it would have exited, and you'd have never known the difference. So this is how it was designed to perform at 150 yards. But it will also perform at 550 yards, and that balance was the tough part. But it's got the accuracy to do those longer shots, and it's got the terminal performance to do everything in between.
Right. And they're viable match bullets. Like
We've all shot matches
successfully shot, several matches with ELD-X bullets. Yep.
As a corollary, there you go. And that's one of the reasons I like them. I like to have ammo loaded with them around. With like, oh, I'm got some time to go bang some steel, or I'm going to get tuned up for hunting season. It's like, I don't even have to question what ammo I take. I can just grab ELD-X's and know I'm going to be able to engage targets much further than I would hunt and still have confidence of my ability to shoot a group at those ranges. And I can practice with what I hunt with, shoot a match with them if I need to. It's just an outstanding bullet that took, I don't even want to know the man hours from 2013, 14 time frame until we launched them in 2015. The man hours.
We should just call them man months.
Man months, yeah.
Because it took a lot.
Yeah. Well,
the accuracy was a challenge. I mean, it was a challenge.
And I feel like one of the problems or questions I get was, why didn't you go bonded? And I feel like now this is tangential to our actual conversation, but maybe a good time to mention it. I discussed this with Joseph Von Benedict on his podcast. If you haven't checked out the Backcountry Hunter podcast, check that one out. They're hunting the backcountry, excuse me. We discussed it there. Why didn't we continue with a bonded bullet for the ELD-X? Because we get that question a lot. And I know you guys pursued it briefly.
The manufacturing process, initially, the criteria was, and the constraint really, these have to be match accurate. You're going to be if your guys are going to be taking these long range distances, they have to be ethically on target, and that your bullets got to shoot well.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm trying to say.
Non-negotiable.
Yeah.
The manufacturing process of bonding a bullet lends itself to making that very difficult. Because you have to. It's just more processes. You're more handling. You don't have the control on the jackets like you do in a one tooling setup in line. Put a core in, put lead in, and you got a finished product at the end. Some point or another, if you're bonding, you have to have a jacket, and then you got to put a piece of lead in it, and then you got to bond it,
which takes heat.
Yes,
takes a lot of heat. But just that process alone, it's like, well, I got this bonded jacket, and now I got to finish it, put it back in the press, swedge it up, put a tip in it, and all that, and now we got to test it and make sure they shoot what we want them to shoot. And so all those variables in that process stream make it more difficult to get the accuracy we wanted.
And to control expansion you're stuck using pure lead with bonded bullets.
Can't use an antimony, make that harder lead.
Yeah, so the lead's very soft. To control that expansion, you have to have a super thick jacket, which makes it even harder to draw
concentrically. Your jacket's dead soft.
Right, and then you anneal it when you bond it, so it's dead soft again. And then the lead and copper are bonded together, and so when a regular cup and core bullet, we push on the lead, it slides past the copper, no problem. When you bond it and you push on the lead, it pulls and stretches the copper with it. And that so basically in the bonding process, you get these little funnels in there where it shrinks, the lead shrinks back down, and they're not uniform. And so to try to clean those up, you move copper and lead around, and it's
We have shot a ton of bonded bullets, and some of them shoot okay, but day in, day out,
millions
you
of
cannot
bullets.
achieve. We feel like you cannot achieve the level of accuracy required for extended range with a bonded bullet versus a conventional drawn.
Yep. All right. I just wanted to.
Yeah. Or I mean, if you can, it's so much work that the price is then just going to go through the
You
roof.
can't make volumes of it.
Right.
And from a terminal performance standpoint, the bonded bullets offer good terminal performance, but in my estimation and in my ballistics testing in gel of both products, the inner bond or our bonded bullets don't do anything that the CX doesn't already do better.
Yeah,
That's
CX or
correct.
ELD-X, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there was really no benefit
interlock
there.
or
Or
SST.
Aspire.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at gel, which is, I don't know, need to do a video series on that or something, but the
Actual 10% ordnance gelatin.
yeah,
Yep.
the cavities produced and the tissue damage that you're doing, it's not as night and day different as a lot of people would like to think.
Sure.
Like if we threw blocks of gel up there with no bullets and then be like, pick one.
Yeah, which bullet did
Which
this?
bullet did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hard pressed.
So again, kind of somewhat unrelated, down a rabbit hole real quick, but I thought a good time to address it to the listener because we do get that inner bond question quite a bit. But you heard it here. There it is. That's why we went with cup and core for the ELD-X. So we outlined the CX. We've outlined the ELD-X. We've talked about what they do great, what they do good, and what they do not as good as some other products in the lineup. Now, when it comes down to now you have to pick one, I feel like just listening to the front half of that podcast, the average hunter or shooter would be able to make a really good, educated decision for them and their specific situation. But let's throw out some specific situations. So one of the biggest ones is us on the prairie and then everyone west of us for the most part. You're hunting sandhills, you're hunting badlands, you're hunting open terrain, high desert terrain. Sometimes you're not getting any closer. And where do you draw the line between, okay, in those scenarios, Western hunter, Great Plains hunter, do I choose CX versus ELD-X? Because for me personally, the cartridge selection certainly comes into play, and obviously the game.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you guys assess that in that, okay, I'm a Western hunter, out here on the prairie type of hunter, what am I going with?
I think a lot of it comes down to knowing your abilities and limiting yourself on shot distance. Like a lot of guys nowadays, they can take a shot at 600 yards on an antelope or a mule deer, and their best choice probably is going to be ELD-X because you know you can get that efficient expansion down those lower velocities. But if you know, hey, I'm not going to take a shot past 350 yards, 300 yards, regardless of the scenario, been hunting for long enough, I don't need to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Then maybe CX is the best way to go. You know, you're taking those more traditional range shots, higher velocities are more guaranteed, higher impacts. Maybe that's the best way to go. So I think a lot of it comes down to abilities and expectations on what your shot's going to be.
Joe, how do you approach that one? Because I know you individually and then you with your kids and your wife spend a lot of time hunting the West. How do you break that down?
So for me, I love having the options, right? We outlined and we changed them. I think that's fun.
Yep.
I like it. I look at I look of bullets, cartridges, guns. They're my toolbox. Those are the tools in my toolbox. So I'm going on a hunt that's a Western high desert antelope mule deer hunt, wide open country. Shot maybe 100 yards, shot maybe 450 yards. Don't know. And you're confident in all those things. ELD-X, hands down.
Every time.
Because it covers everything, and the accuracy is there. I'm going to go hunting in the mountains for an elk, and I know there's going to be a ton of black timber, right? It's rifle season. They've been pressured. They're going to be in the timber. Shots are going to be, 100 yards is a long shot. Okay, I may hit a little meadow, and it's 300 yards. CX. So for that hunt, CX all the time. We talked about brush country and Africa Plains game. CX, man, just sign them up.
Mm-hmm.
So I think is where you're going and what are you pursuing. Going to Alaska, or you're going up north. Are there other bears involved? You may run across or something. Oh man, I better have a really tough bullet for that. CX.
Okay.
So you just
Yep.
I look at it as what am I doing? What job am I doing? And then what tool do I need out of my toolbox?
So I'd like to throw this one at you. You kind of teed this up perfectly. So you've got your toolbox. You didn't necessarily mention caliber or cartridge selection, but I'd like to hear you talk through that because you and your wife went on a backcountry DIY. You're the only two people from horizon to horizon for a moose in Alaska. Walk us through why you chose the bullet you
For that
chose
specific,
and how that all went down.
So that one was, to me, that one came down to be pretty easy, but it was fun. I knew I was getting dropped off on top of a hill with semi-open terrain. We were not doing the float hunt down in the bottoms where it's all alders and willows and calling them in really close. This was a chance for you're on a hill and you're calling and the moose presents itself at 100, 500, doesn't matter.
Yep.
And I knew that we were going to have bears live there.
Okay.
Bears and wolves there. So it was like, okay, instantly 30 cal. So I know I can load a big heavy bullet just in case of
Brown
bears.
bear. Yeah.
Brown bears. So 300 PRC. Then it's like, okay, got the rifle scoped, everything's good. What bullet? Well, I know I'm going to shoot maybe 100 yards, or I know I might have to shoot 400 yards. Instantly, you know it's ELD-X. Because an ELD-X you shoot a bear with that thing, yeah, it might only penetrate 24 inches, but he's going to have a softball
out of a
or
300
volleyball
PRC.
out of a PRC. So for that, it was really, it came down to be like, that's the job that we need to do. And hindsight now, 2020, looking back, made the absolute perfect choice. Like, couldn't have made a better choice.
Because as it played out.
Yeah, absolutely. It was brutal. It was hard. It was different than I expected. And the moose that we killed was the only chance that we shouldered the gun was 485 yards away. And that's it. We went closer and called and raked and he laid there. He had his cows. He gave 2 flying flips that we sounded attractive over there. He didn't care. He had his ladies. So then finally you were off and you couldn't see him at close. You couldn't just sneak up on him. It's so thick, you're not just going to walk up there and get, spot and stalk. So you get in a position where when he stands up in the trees that he makes himself presented a shot, then you shoot.
Perfect.
So,
that's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. You walk through not only the game you're after and the distances you're after that game, but also what other animals live in the area.
Absolutely.
And that dictated your caliber and your cartridge selection. And should you have chosen a different cartridge and caliber, you might have chosen a different bullet.
Absolutely.
6.5 PRC, for example, obviously I wouldn't recommend that on that hunt, but should that be an option for you, the CX is a way better option, in my opinion, than an ELD-X if you're in brown bear country.
It was a 7 or a 300.
Yeah.
Because of that, but it had to be shootable, right? Christina had to be able to shoot the rifle very effectively. So I can't just have some gun that
hand cannon.
Exactly.
338. Yep. Rum. Yeah.
Because I would have loved to take a 6.5, right? Loved it. Shoot it, super accurate, confident. But man, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage with the other stuff in that scenario. So.
SnapSafe modular assembly system locks the thick steel exterior together in minutes anywhere in the home. Featuring a pry-resistant 3/16-inch solid steel door, 8 1-inch chrome steel live locking bolts, digital or mechanical locking options, 9-gauge steel exterior walls, 2300 degree Fahrenheit 1-hour fire shield protection, fully adjustable shelving, and a lifetime warranty. SnapSafe, a modular safe with welded safe security.
So I'd like to share a little anecdote as well about CX versus ELD-X. We've shared this story on the podcast. We actually did a podcast while we were doing it. I don't know what episodes, but Preston and I flew out to Idaho for a work event, drove the length of Wyoming the next day, very early in the morning, to get to the eastern edge of Wyoming to go on an antelope hunt. And we were out there for a media event in Idaho, so we used one of our media rifles, and this was right when we debuted the CX bullet. We just announced it. So we had the 130 grain CX loaded up in the 6.5 PRC, suppressed. We go out there, had a very challenging hunt to say the least, and we got one opportunity at one buck antelope, and that was it on public land. And this 300-yard shot, and everything went great. Preston made a perfect shot, and the antelope ran way further than I thought because, he absolutely 10-ringed this thing. I don't remember because we didn't gut it. We gutless field dressed it to pack it out of there, but I could almost guarantee there was no heart in that animal. It was a perfect shot for a heart shot. and that animal ran way further than I would have ever expected. And he was certainly dead on his feet. But I feel like in that scenario, if we could do it all over again, I feel like hunting, kind of that high desert area, hunting a not very big animal at, shot distances might be non-traditional. I feel like the ELD-X would have been a better bullet for that particular job because it's going to expand a little bit faster, a little bit more dramatically, and in a smaller animal like an antelope, not only can you get through the thoracic cavity, take the top off the heart, hit the lungs and all that, that dramatic expansion can also disrupt the electrical activity in the central nervous system and can render them unconscious pretty quickly, take them off their feet, and then they generally aren't robust enough to regain consciousness and get back up like an elk. So I feel like, in my opinion, if we had all of our tools in our toolbox there, maybe we would have chose the ELD-X in that specific application.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I think in my mind, you could definitely match the penetration capability to the size of the animal.
There you go.
I think that might be, and I kind of don't see a point for, not that my opinion matters to everybody, but within,
especially the internet,
right? But from smaller than whitetail and smaller, I don't know that CX does that much for you. Like a cup and core bullet is going to, that wound cavity is going to get all the way through that animal, right?
Yeah.
To the offside hide or, whatever. You're going to take out the vital zone with a cup and core bullet. Whereas when you start getting mule deer, elk, moose, African game, that's where your CX and that deep penetration is really going to pay off for you.
There you go.
Because generally what you see with CX is maybe not quite as big of a temporary permanent cavity, but it definitely carries longer, way longer. Yeah. Yep. And if that's outside of the backside of the animal, it's not doing any good for you.
Yep. That's a good way to approach it. And now when I look, on the eastern half of the United States, in the traditional Midwest, and down in the Northeast and the Southwest, where it's obviously way heavier with timber. I didn't know this, but Nebraska ranks right near the bottom. I can't remember if it's dead last or second or third to last of most square miles or as a percentage of the state with no trees.
Really?
Yeah, it is. It is right near the bottom, which stands to reason. I feel like Nebraska gets the flat trees, cornfield type of thing, and most folks don't understand that's about a third of the state. And then the other 2/3, there are no trees.
It's wide open.
And it is very hilly, and it's kind of a neat juxtaposition to be in that ecotone, because Grand Island's right in the middle. You go west of Grand Island, it gets hilly, sandy, and treeless in a hurry. And if you go east, it gets the exact opposite, which is unique. Anyway, so we don't have a lot of trees and timber. But you go east of us, and those, you look at Tennessee and Georgia and all these places where the forests are just thick. Ohio, you get these big stands of really dense timber.
Wisconsin, Michigan, all of that up through there.
So where I look at those states where they have a huge deer population, Michigan, Wisconsin, list goes on, where the number of deer that they have, and the number of deer that they harvest every year is just astronomically higher than what we experience here on the prairie. I think going with the ELD-X is probably a better option because of the faster expansion at those traditional distances. But one thing I wanted to bring up, though, in those areas where they're harvesting a huge amount of deer and they're getting youth involved, I love that about this country as a whole. But every time I travel east, and I've got friends that live, in the Midwest and in the South and the Northeast, that they get their kids involved so young in places like Texas and Missouri and wherever. They'll let anybody with pulse shoot a deer. Does Missouri even have a 6 years old you can shoot a deer? I think in that situation, you have younger shooters, so you're going to go smaller caliber, smaller cartridge. I think about something like the 6mm arc. So you load up a 6mm arc for a youth shooter to shoot a deer at a traditional range. I really think a CX is a benefit there when you're going smaller in caliber. And you're bordering maybe a 6mm and 22 cals, not that big, but you're shooting deer at traditional range, so it's more than enough. Obviously, it's legal. That's when I see a CX being a big benefit in those denser forested areas where it's tough to hunt, period, just because you can't see very far. That makes it difficult. Plus, when you do get your shot opportunity, you got to take it now. And I
Yep.
feel like as a youth shooter, shot placement might be,
Less than perfect that we talked about earlier.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
less than perfect.
Absolutely.
and you're with a smaller caliber, man, I really feel like those CXs stand out for that specific situation, in my
Well,
opinion.
Yeah, and that's so a few years back I went with Jaden. He was elk hunting. I got a leftover bear tag in Colorado, and I took a 6-arc 18-inch bolt action rifle. But I loaded up 90 grain at that time GMXs because
Why not?
yeah,
Why not?
like
Yeah,
it's
of course.
if I hit a big black bear, it's gonna make it through.
Yeah.
Right. And we did a little bit of testing before that, checking velocities and whatnot. But it's like that gun cartridge really is 300 and in regardless.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
it's like, yeah.
It was a no-brainer at that
Yeah.
point. You knew, here's my shot distance, here's my game, CX is my ticket.
So, in summary, when you look at ELD-X versus CX, the first answer is educate yourself on the performance of each. Listen to this podcast, listen to episode 7, listen to episode 87. The other thing that I've always stressed in my days up in tech answering the phone is, as the hunter and shooter, you need to align your expectations with reality, and that education piece fits right in there. Understand how the bullet was designed, how it is going to perform in various different scenarios, and if your expectations are outside of its design intent, then don't be shocked if it performs outside your expectations. So it really comes back to education and choosing the right bullet for the right job. I feel like the CX bullets, the new ones, the 190, the 160, the 130, the 90, those bullets really blur the line between ELD-X and ELD matching. If you're in that gray area where, man, I don't know what I should choose.
Sure.
If you're shooting a modern cartridge that can support these bullets, that has the right twist rate and head height, that CX with that high performance shape is really a really good middle ground. And
It is.
so I'd ask just around the table, Joe, I think I probably already know your answer. You can answer both or prefer not to answer, but do you guys have a preferred preference? Like, oh, yeah, I prefer the ELD-X, but I know I can shoot the CX if I need to. Do you guys have a preference of the two?
I will always have a spot in my heart for the ELD-X, and I still prefer that. I would say in most occasions, but there can be, I haven't gone on them yet, but occasions, a certain hunt where I'd rather have a CX.
Okay.
It'd probably be an elk hunt.
Yeah, something a little more robust.
But like you said, it's going to be with a modern cartridge, quote unquote, where you could use the 160 grain CX and the 7 PRC, that type of thing. So I know I can push the line a little bit compared to more traditional cartridges. So yeah, in general ELD-X, but
Okay.
there are situations where CX would be better.
Yeah. Miles, you got a preference of the two, or are you agnostic?
For hunting, not really. I really, I haven't seen what I've seen in gel and whatnot with the CX. It's impressive, honestly, and the same for the ELD-X. So
Yeah.
I think fit it to the hunt.
Yep, you're indifferent. Yep.
Yeah.
Pick one. And Joe, I think I know your answer.
North America, for the most hunting we do, it's ELD-X, but there is a place where you better have CX in your box.
Yep. I think I'm in that same camp as Ryan and Joe. For whatever reason, I just gravitate to those ELD-Xs. I've helped with the development of some of the newer ones as far as regarding the terminal performance testing. I've seen the terminal performance in gel. I've seen the terminal performance in real life. I've done it. I've seen it. I trust it. And it's going to be hard for me not to just naturally gravitate to that first. So, Seth, you're going on this hunt. My default is ELD-X.
That's a good
And
way to
then
put it.
I assess, okay, do I need to switch from the
That's a
ELD-X?
good point.
But I have definitely shot stuff with the CX, and I've been thoroughly impressed. Again, the terminal performance to spare, plus those really high performance pipe hitters that we mentioned that blur the line between the two bullets.
Yeah.
But Joe, I think we could summarize the whole podcast in saying they're tools in the toolbox. Be cognizant, be educated, use the right tool.
Understand your tools. Yep.
Anything else, guys, that we missed that you want to wrap up this podcast with on the ELD-X or the CX or about the upcoming hunting season? Because it's coming.
It is. I can't wait.
I
I'm looking
know.
forward to it. So, no, I think we did a good job. I think we
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think we covered.
hopefully gave our listener a lot of useful information they can take home and use, I hope.
Excellent. Well, with that, guys, we'll get back to our Friday and your regular scheduled programming.
Thanks, Seth.
All right. Thank you, guys. Everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode on the CX versus the ELD-X. Like we mentioned, they're 2 tools for your toolbox. Be educated, choose the right one. We appreciate it. Catch you on the next one.